additional language learning or foreign language learning. Firstly, I'm Janina, and somehow associated with SAFRA and the department. The field of additional language learning and learning difficulties is a field that's gradually developed in Israel over the last 2 to 3 decades. And as we all know, but maybe just to put it in the context of Richard and what he's going to be presenting, English is acquired sequentially as a second language for Hebrew language 1 speakers and as a third or fourth language for Arabic language 1 speakers. It's acquired as a third language for other minority groups. I know I work with Circassian students, Russian language 1 students. And we also know that the field of additional language learning and learning difficulties is very relevant in our context to acquisition of Hebrew as a second language for Arabic and other minority language 1 speakers. Arabic is a second language for Hebrew language 1 speakers, and the complex situation of dyslexia, where Arabic language 1 speakers acquire the literary version of Arabic when they enter school. And within the aforementioned context, each individual appears somewhere on the language continuum, and their language abilities or aptitude will impact the success they have in acquiring additional languages. There's much research to do in this field, as we all agree, and Professor Richard Sparks is one of the pioneers in the field, conducting extensive research investigating the linguistic coding differences, hypothesis, foreign language literacy acquisition through the lens of the simple view of reading, the problems of language learning disability diagnosis and foreign language learning. We're going to hear more about that. And he extends his research into areas such as ADHD and foreign language acquisition and hyperlexia and foreign language acquisition. My collaboration with Richard goes back to 1995 when I was registering here for a Ph.D. in the education department in the Moked L'Kri'ah, the reading speciality. Shelley knows about that, with Professor Joseph Chevron. And I was looking for a second Ph.D. supervisor from the field of learning disabilities or learning difficulties in foreign language acquisition. And I'd read articles by Richard and Leonore Ganschow and their colleagues, and they were energetically investigating many questions in the field that I was heading into. So I wrote to Leonore Ganschow and I asked if she would consider supervising a thesis with Joseph Chevron from far, and she said she wasn't able to do it, but she said I should consider approaching her younger research partner, Richard Sparks, who might agree. So I wrote to Richard and he agreed. And this was the start of a long and fruitful collaboration that continues to this day. Richard's a great friend of ours here in Israel. He visited us in 2011, and he told me at the end of that visit that he would be back. So we're delighted to host him again and for him to give this talk within the framework of the SAFRA series, lecture series. And I thank, well, Sfeer's not here, but I thank her and Tami Katsir and Anat for their enthusiasm in inviting Richard to give this talk. And of course, Claudia, who's also not here, for organizing it all. So let's get going.
Thank you to everyone for inviting me, and Haifa, and especially to Janina for hosting me and getting me back here. What I'm going to try to do today is to give you some insight into some of the research in the United States that we've been doing. Let me just give you my background a bit. I fell into this research late 80s, totally by accident. My field is learning disabilities, reading disabilities, dyslexia. I was a learning disability teacher for many years. And unfortunately, I grew up in the rural parts of Kentucky in the United States. I studied Latin, but we never had the opportunity to study a foreign language at all. So I wish I did, but I don't speak a foreign language. But I study it. And I said, I fell into this just by accident, because what happened was students with learning disabilities started going to college. And what happened is that these students were having difficulty fulfilling the foreign language requirement at American universities. Now, being in learning disabilities, we thought, well, yeah, that makes sense to us. but it didn't make sense to people in the foreign language field. So we started studying this, and as you'll see, we started off with case studies. We moved up to a little bit bigger studies and just kept going. We never really quit because the findings were always so interesting. Now, before I get into the research, I want to just set the context for the United States. Those of you who have been in the States know that the context for learning a foreign language is very, 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 very different. Very different. But once I do that, then we're going to go into some of the early studies. I'm going to go through those quickly because I'd rather get to more of the new things. And then we'll talk about studies with students with learning disabilities, some of the longitudinal studies that we've been doing, and some of the new studies that we've been doing. As we go through, I prefer to make this a conversation, so just when you have a question, just raise your hand and ask. Don't wait until the end. It's much easier just to talk. So let's set the context for studies on foreign language in the United States. Unlike other countries, most of you may know that U.S. students generally don't begin the formal study of a foreign language until way too late, until high school. They're usually 13 or 14 and sometimes even 15. The problem is that they study the second language not to become fluent or literate. They study it as a subject, just like math. So third period you have Spanish, or fourth period you have French. It's a subject. It's not really become fluent or literate. Not that some people or some students don't. They do, but very, very few. Not all secondary and post-secondary students are even enrolled in second language courses in the United States. Only about, in a typical high school, maybe 60 to 70% are enrolled. It's not required for graduation in most states. There's maybe one state that does, but it's not required for graduation, so you don't have to take it. And when it's required, they usually enroll in 2 years. So I'm doing a study right now where we have about 300 students who will go through Spanish 1 and Spanish 2. But when we go to Spanish 3, that will diminish probably about 50 or 60 students. And if we went to Spanish 4, it would be fewer students. Even after 4 years of study in the United States, U.S. students have a very low level of L2 proficiency. They just don't know a whole lot. And almost no studies, I was describing to Honey and Janine on the way over, almost no studies have examined how well U.S. students actually learn to read or write or speak a foreign language. We really don't know. I've been trying to find literature on this, and it's just not there. So the study we're doing right now will provide some insight into that. Only about 18% of Americans report even speaking a language other than English, unless you're in a particular area of the country, like Santa Fe. Lots of people are going to be speaking Spanish, but if you go to Oklahoma or Ohio, you don't see lots of people, hear lots of people speaking a foreign language. There are very few opportunities for students to study second languages in elementary school programs. There's a few. In Cincinnati, we have a German bilingual program where they study it from kindergarten. But there are very few opportunities like this throughout the country. Of course, there's little or no exposure outside of school to the second language. Basically, they get 1 hour a day. The second period, you go to Spanish. You leave that and you go to math, where everybody's speaking English. You go outside of the halls of school, everybody's speaking English. You go home, everybody's speaking English. You watch TV, it's English. So you don't get a lot of exposure to the second language. There's really no economic incentive or social incentive to learn a second language either. Depending on the area of the country, there might be, but there's very little of that. It's not a part of any state or national curriculum. And when we got into this field, the reason that we were able to enter the research arena so quickly, even though we weren't second language educators, is that there are just a multitude of theories of how students learn a foreign language and why they don't. You would hear hypotheses about this, hypotheses about that, about this, about that, and we're going, what's going on here? Why don't you know this? You've been studying this for a while, but you don't know it. Now, all of this is not the most positive light on the United States, obviously, okay? But because the field was wide open, we had the opportunity to study just about anything we wanted to study. It really didn't make any difference what we wanted to study. The other thing that is important is this, and we've been realizing this over the past 5 or 6 years. Because students obviously learn to speak their native language early, they study their native language for 8 years, 9 years counting kindergarten in school, and they don't start foreign language until high school. There's this marvelous opportunity to study the relationships between your first language, which you've been studying for 13 or 14 years, and a second language, which you don't start until about 13 or 14. And so lots of our studies have been going back we did a 10-year study, which I'm going to describe, where we followed kids from the beginning of the 1st grade to the end of the 10th grade. We followed them over 10 years. And looked at how well their first language skills predicted, way back when in the 1st and 2nd grade, predicted their second language skills. And that's hard to do in other countries because you don't have that time lapse. And of course we found lots of relationships, strong relationships between the two skills. Okay, so I'm going to run through these next studies, please. Next studies very quickly, because these are our early studies that we conducted many, many years ago and set the base for what we did. Here was our hypothesis at the beginning of our research was so simple, I just included a very simple diagram. And I show this to most audiences. Our hypothesis as native language educators was just kind of logical. That your ability to learn a second language is going to be built upon your ability in your first language. That just made sense to us. How could you learn a second language better than you learned your first language? It just made sense. So that was the basis of our hypothesis. And so what we said was that students' first language skills serve as the foundation for their second language aptitude and their second language achievement. So if your English was your native language, your achievement in Spanish or your second language aptitude would be based on English. We also hypothesized that both first and second language learning depend on language learning mechanisms that are similar in both languages. We also suggested that second language aptitude is componential. So if you had problems, for example, in the phonology of your first language, there was a strong probability that you would have problems with phonology in a second language. And that each of those components, even though those components were separate, in previous articles we suggested that they were modular, that you could be very good, for example, in grammar of your first language, but very poor in phonology. Have a very strong vocabulary, but maybe have very, very poor grammar. And we've done some studies which suggest that it indeed is componential. But that problem with one component of language would cause difficulties in a second component. So we started off with just case studies. We didn't know if our hypothesis was any good. We had no idea. So we started off with case studies and found that indeed students who were having foreign language learning problems, and all of these were college students, had a history of difficulties in their second language. When we tested them, we found they had difficulties with reading and spelling, with decoding and with spelling, that they really didn't like reading and writing very much. They had great grades in math and science, non-language classes, and some of them even had speech and language therapy back when they were little kids. Lots of times they would go into the foreign language classroom at the college level and they would have problems immediately. They would say things like, the teacher talks too fast. I have to spend 3 times as much time on studying Spanish as I do everything else. Most of them would try to memorize things, but that didn't work so well. It worked a little bit to pass a quiz, but it didn't really work very well. And some had problems right away, some after the first semester. When we gave them standardized tests, we found that their IQs were average to above average. These were not students who had significant difficulties with intellectual ability, but they had very low scores on phonological processing measures or decoding spelling. They had very low first language grammar scores, but they had very good vocabulary, and they also had very good language comprehension. Their listening comprehension was excellent. Is anybody familiar with the modern language aptitude test? I'm going to talk about that. I'll do it a little later. But it's an, I'm sorry.
The L2 is always Spanish?
No, Spanish usually. Spanish is the first, then French, then German. Those seem to be the 3. Latin too, but since we don't speak it, then we really don't study it.
And did you look on the component of the language? Is it harder to learn German as opposed to Spanish? As the target language?
When we started this research, we would ask foreign language teachers, what's the easiest foreign language? And they were reluctant to answer. They didn't want to say. But eventually, as we got into this, it's Spanish, because the languages are very similar. The orthographies are similar. It's a very simple, very transparent orthography. French is a little less. German is difficult. Very difficult. So, but yeah. The modern language aptitude test is indeed just an aptitude test, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but most of these students had very low scores on that too. So our inferences were simply that poor second language learners had native language learning problems. They had low phonological processing skills. They had low grammar difficulties, reading and spelling problems in their first language, and low second language aptitude. So we thought from there, this is a fruitful area of research. So we started a series of studies, and here's what we said, and here's why I'm going to move through these slides fairly quickly. We asked the question, in which language skills do poor foreign language learners differ when compared to good foreign language learners? So we would take students who did very well in foreign language, they would come out of those courses with grades of A, sometimes B, and compare them to students who would get D's and F's in the courses, would drop out of the courses because they couldn't pass. And what we found, basically, was we compared them on all of these different kinds of measures, and IQ and others. And what we found, here's the modern language aptitude test, so let me back up a second. What we found is this, is that the students, good and poor foreign language learners, didn't differ in IQ. There were never any differences in their intellectual ability. There were always differences in their phonological skills. Because they couldn't decode very well, they had some difficulties with reading comprehension because, of course, you have to decode the words to get to the comprehension. But if we gave them a picture vocabulary test where they didn't have to read, their scores were just like the good foreign language learners in their native language. No difficulties at all, very strong. Grammar, sometimes there was differences. We thought, well, some foreign language educators told us, you know, if you're really good at math, you're going to be a great foreign language learner. That was really odd. Others would say, no, don't listen to them. That if you're really good at music, you're going to be a really good foreign language.
Hey, this is true.
And, well, I stand before you a true musical idiot. I'm not tone deaf, but I'm close. They kicked me out of band when I was 8 years old. Literally. They kicked me out of church choir when I was 10. I thought I was really good, but I wasn't. But foreign languages, Latin was a piece of cake. I mean, it was easy. It was easy. But we didn't find any differences there. And of course, there were always differences on the MLAT. Always differences. Now, let me just quickly, the MLAT, let me just talk about this because I still want somebody, if there's somebody in this room who would like to pursue this, okay, I still want someone to take the MLAT and translate it into Hebrew. And then I'd like to do a study where we look at that, their performance on that foreign language aptitude test in Hebrew and see if the findings are similar to what we found in English. Unfortunately, the test is only in the English version right now. So anybody who's looking at a Ph.D. down the road.
Somebody's considering doing it in Arabic.
But what it does is it uses a fake foreign language in English. It's administered in CD. It takes about an hour. John Carroll, very famous psychologist, did a lot of factor analytic studies way back in the 50s and the 60s and found that 4 separate factors contributed to second language aptitude. And there's the factors right there. So it's a marvelous test. Those are just the subtests. So what we found, as I said, no group differences in IQ, significant differences on all of those other measures that we mentioned. Here's an example of what we found. This is just some of the studies that we did. Here, in the red are the high-achieving students on these measures. The blue are the low-achieving students. So, for example, here's the MLAT score from the high-achieving group. Here's the MLAT score from the low-achieving group. So you can see how the high-achieving group did much better. Another study, we found exactly the same thing. Another study, same thing. Another study, same thing. And over and over and over. We added, by the way, in this study, we had an average group. Students who were high on this end, low on this end, and a group in the middle. And you can see that, for the most part, the green X's, which is the average group, were in the middle of the high-achieving and the low-achieving group. So it all kind of panned out exactly the way that we thought that it would over a number of studies throughout the 1990s. Now, an important point is that in those studies that I just showed you, let me just go back to this one, you don't see a lot of test scores. There's a few, but you don't see a lot of test scores in the below average range, do you? And the reason is that in the United States, if your first language skills are in the below average range, the likelihood that you're going to be enrolled in the foreign language in high school is slim. You probably won't enroll. That's where we get the 60 to 70% who do, the 30 to 40% who don't. You're not recommended for a foreign language, and the only reason, if your first language skills were here, and you were enrolled in a foreign language course, the only reason would be is that your parents wanted you to do it, and the school will say, yeah, okay, if you want to do it, that's fine. We don't guarantee what's going to happen, but we just don't see students enroll who have low first language skills. And we should have expected that. It was surprising to us at first, but then we should have expected it because those students just typically don't enroll. So our inferences were that good and poor foreign language learners exhibit differences in the skills that we've talked about so far, which to native language educators like us in learning disabilities, that made perfect sense. We also looked at the best predictors of second language proficiency and achievement. We followed students in a couple of high schools, both public and private, over 2 years of Spanish, French, and German. Administered all sorts of IQ tests, native language achievement tests, the MLAT. We collected their grades, but what we did in this study was we worked with foreign language educators to come in and develop proficiency tests of Spanish, French, and German, because Dr. Gensha and I couldn't do that. So what they would do is they would come in, develop reading tests in Spanish, spelling test in Spanish, oral proficiency test, and then they would test them. And what we found, best predictors of second language grades at the end of the first year in Spanish were those measures: your eighth grade English grade, your second language aptitude, and surprisingly, first language spelling was a good predictor. Your overall proficiency at the end of second year Spanish, French, or German was second language word decoding. How you did in a second language word decoding was very good at predicting how well you were going to speak the language, read the language, spell the language, write the language. And of course, there's the MLAT again. You're going to see the MLAT being a good predictor of second language proficiency over and over and over again. Okay, other studies are differences in first language skills related to differences in second language proficiency. The answer is yes. Same kinds of studies that we did. What we did is we followed these students over a number of years and found the same kind of things. As I said, I'm going to skip through some of these quickly. But here's another example. Here's what we looked at, students who had been tested in Spanish or French or German. And what we did is we divided them into high proficiency groups in Spanish, average proficiency, low proficiency. And then we measured their performance on first language tests and second language aptitude tests. The red X's are the high achieving group, the blue X's are the low achieving group. Same kind of thing there. So over and over and over again, we were finding that your first language skills are strongly related to two things: your second language aptitude on the MLAT and your second language proficiency in reading, writing, speaking, and comprehending a second language. Okay? Now, in the United States, I don't know if you have this in Israel. The United States, when we started doing this in the 80s and the 90s, the big, most prominent theory of why students had difficulties learning a foreign language were what were called affective theories. Affective theories are, you don't learn a second language because you have foreign language anxiety. And it was a specific kind of anxiety that wasn't generalized. It was just specific to learning a foreign language. And there was instruments, there were instruments that had been developed to test second language anxiety on U.S. students. Motivation was also a very prominent theory, that you learned a second language because you were motivated to do so. And there were all other theories involving personality and attitudes towards second language speakers, all sorts of things. And we thought that was odd. And the reason we thought it was odd is in English, you don't learn to read English because you have anxiety. You don't learn to read English because either you're strongly motivated or you're not. That just was odd to us. And we thought, well, why would they do that? So we started testing this theory. So what we did is we administered their measures of motivation and anxiety, measured the students' first language skills, divided them into high anxious groups, average anxious groups, low anxious groups. And here's what we found. The low anxious groups are the students in red. Here are their first language skills. They're high, right? Average anxiety are the green, and the high anxiety are the blue. And what we were beginning to find was that your level of anxiety or motivation was related to your level of language ability. So if you're weaker in your first language skills, you had higher anxiety. Makes perfect sense. If you were weaker in your first language skills, you had lower motivation to learn the second language. So these findings were very new in the foreign language field, and they weren't really well accepted at first because the anxiety and the motivation theories were very, very strong. Another study, same exact thing. Another study with a different group, same thing. And so over and over again, we kept finding the same thing. You'll hear more about the anxiety theory a little bit later when we talk about that. So here we are again, back to first language skills, second language aptitude. So did our studies support our learning coding differences hypothesis? Yes. And we're finding that students' first language skills seem to serve as the foundation for their second language aptitude and their second language proficiency and achievement. So generally, the results of the study supported our premises. And by the way, if anybody, I know that we're taping this, but if anybody would like a copy of the PowerPoint, just write me an email and ask me, and I'll be happy to send it to you. Because I know we're going through this fast today. Feel free to do that. In addition, the results of our studies were supported Cummins' linguistic interdependence hypothesis. Cummins hypothesized that first language and second languages are interdependent, rest on a common underlying proficiency, and success in second language is dependent primarily on first language skills developed prior to second language exposure. All of our studies were supporting his hypothesis. Now, how many of you are in learning disabilities?
All of
Oh, all of you are in learning disabilities. Well, then you're gonna. Well, I don't know if you're going to love this. We'll see. In the United States, learning disabilities is extraordinarily controversial, and as we go through here, you're going to see why. Ganschow and I assume, since obviously we're learning disabilities professors, we assume that students who were classified as LD would have second language learning problems. Why? Because, well, you have problems in your first language. You have language problems, you have reading problems, you have decoding problems. So it made sense. We also made the assumption that failure to learn a second language is a disability. And we were wrong. We were very, very wrong about that. We had no evidence for those assumptions. We just made them. We did, and then we investigated them. So our research questions were these. Do high school and college students classified as LD in second language classes and low-achieving non-LD students in language classes differ in IQ, first language skills, or second language aptitude? And here's the reason we investigated that. The reason is there's supposed to be something different about students with learning disabilities than students who have trouble reading and writing, and students without learning disabilities who have trouble reading and writing. And keep in mind, this was 1990 when we started this. And so we wondered, is that true? Is that true? So we started doing investigations, which I'll describe. The second question was, is there a disability for learning a foreign language? And the reason that we investigated that was that we started hearing this term. We'd go to conferences and we started hearing this term, foreign language learning disability. Well, that's interesting. But we didn't know if that was true. Now, the problems in answering these questions, at least in the United States, you can tell me about Israel if you'd like, but the problems in answering these questions are related to the problems in the United States with the definition and diagnosis of LD. No one in the United States agrees on the definition of LD and the diagnosis. It is literally a free-for-all. Literally a free-for-all. Students get diagnosed as LD based on sometimes nothing. And you're going to see what happened in our studies when we use certain kinds of diagnostic criteria for LD, what happened. So as we headed into this is what we were looking at. So our first studies, we looked at high school learning disabled students, in other words, LD students enrolled in high school foreign language courses, and at-risk students in second language classes. Now, how did we define at-risk students? At-risk students were those who, after one semester of Spanish, French, or German, achieved a D or an F in the language. We tried to weed out those students who just didn't come to class, who would sleep in class. In other words, students who weren't trying. And the foreign language teacher would say, don't choose Johnny because he's getting an F only because he's been absent for 10 days. When he comes to class, he doesn't do his homework, he sleeps half the time, etc. We wanted students who really were good, who were trying hard, but didn't do well, okay? So all of our LD students had IEPs. You know what an IEP is? IEP is called Individualized Education Plan. In the United States, we have something called IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities.
There
There you go, good. So you get, an IEP is like a contract, if you will, between the parent and the school. This is what we're going to do for your child. But to get an IEP, you have to have an official diagnosis of disability. Whether you really are disabled or not, you have to have that official diagnosis from the school. So our at-risk students, I've already described that they achieved a D or F in the first part of language. We administered the same test, IQ, first language skills, and the MLAT, and then at the end of one study, we administered oral proficiency interviews in Spanish, French, or German. Here's what we found. In several studies over a period of years, we found no differences, none, between students classified as LD and students not classified as LD, the at-risk students, in all of these skills.
Can you tell us the definition that you used for the students in order to be in the LD?
For this, what we used was, we simply used whether they had the IEP diagnosis or not.
It's a school diagnosis.
School diagnosis, right. Now later on, as you're going to see, we use different diagnoses when we in the college level. But we basically took the school's word for it at that time.
And it was the IQ discrepancy
I-
definition, or you don't know?
It's a free-for-all. Some were discrepancy definition. Some were, in the United States, schools are subject to a lot of parent pressure. So if you've got a kid who's struggling, you think he has a learning disability, you go to the principal and you say, test my kid. And we test him and we say, well, he doesn't have a disability. You say, well, yes, he does. And he'll get an IEP in many cases. Yeah. Yeah. So it's a very, but what we did is we looked at, in there, we had their records. So we looked at their test scores, and we divided them into groups of students who had under a 1 standard deviation discrepancy between IQ and achievement, students who had a 1.0 to 1.49 discrepancy, and students who had a 1.5 or over. No differences. No differences. It was very interesting what we were finding. And that last finding is really problematic because we were taught, it was conventional wisdom in the United States. The larger the discrepancy, the more severe your learning problems were supposed to be. But that's not what we were finding. Not at all. Not at all. So our strong inferences in these studies were that there were no first language or second language aptitude differences between students classified as LD and low achieving non-LD students who were all enrolled in second language classes. No group differences in their second language outcomes and how well they achieved in Spanish, French, German, etc. So what was the difference between the two groups? And the answer that we came up with was really one had diagnosis, one didn't. That was it. That was the only difference. So the findings challenged everyone's assumptions, including our own, that there was this foreign language learning disability. Can students, LD students, learn a foreign language? At least learn it as we define it in the United States, and pass foreign language courses? Well, the answer was yeah. Most of the students who were classified as LD passed foreign language courses. Most students got at least a C or better. But they were supposed to be different, right, than students who didn't have a learning disability. So that led to some college studies. We were very lucky. We were given access to the databases in the Office of Disability Services at a couple of large universities. Now this was back in our first study we started it in 1995 and published the first one in 1996. So in the first study, we had 84 students who were classified, college students who were classified as LD, who were taking foreign languages in college. In the second study, we had 97. Now, because we had all of their records, including their testing records, we had their psychological evaluations, we had everything, we were able to group them by their level of discrepancy. Again, under 1.0, 1.0 to 1.49, over 1.5 between IQ and achievement. We found no differences in their first language skills, their SAT, ACT, which is a college entrance exam, their MLAT scores, all of them had been administered the MLAT by the college, in their college GPA, graduating GPA, all of the students had graduated prior, and in their second language GPA. Nothing, no differences at all. When we grouped them by their scores on their phonological measures, decoding measures, we grouped them by their MLAT scores, we grouped them by whether they had passed or not passed second language courses, Same results, no differences in anything. No differences in anything. Most students who were classified as LD had passed. Now think about this. In college, they were having difficulty. In high school, they had passed second language courses with average or better grades, C's or above, in Spanish or French or German in high school. Even when they took a foreign language course in college, they would sometimes get a passing grade. But in the United States, sometimes you get a waiver from the foreign language requirement. Now we learned in most countries you get a waiver because you're too good at the foreign language. Okay? You already know it, so you don't have to take this course. In the United States, you get a waiver because you're bad. It's different. And now it's common practice, despite the research that you're going to hear, it's very common practice for colleges to give waivers and course substitutions for students classified as LD in college. It's very common. But you have to have that diagnosis. That leads, unfortunately, to a lot of incorrect diagnoses because lots of students and parents of those students want that waiver because foreign language is hard, let's face it, it's hard. So we also found, when we looked at all of these groups, that of this group and this group, separate databases, 60% met no criteria for LD, none. They didn't have a discrepancy, they didn't have low achievement, they had nothing, but they had a diagnosis. Diagnosis. That's the free-for-all that I mentioned. Now, in one study, we were lucky because we also had a group of students classified as LD at the university who had fulfilled the second language requirement in college by passing second language courses. They passed 4 semesters of the second language course, but they had a learning disability, supposedly. So what we did is we took this group, there were 24 of them, and 42 of the students who all had common tests. So they had a WACE or a WISC. They had the Woodcock-Johnson reading, math, writing. We didn't want to compare Woodcock-Johnson to another test. They all had a common testing protocol. When we did that, we found no differences in their IQ, reading, math, writing, their ACT, or their college GPA. So here was a group of students who were classified as LD, who had passed 4 semesters of foreign language in college, and a group of 42 students who had failed foreign language and who had received a course substitution or a waiver. And there were no differences in any of those skills. Now, why was that important? Well, because all of our previous studies showed that students who failed foreign language courses, there were differences between those students in their reading, their writing, everything else, than students who passed the courses. Here, nothing. Nothing. So it starts leading to questions. Why did one group get a waiver or a course substitution and the other didn't? Why would that happen? Basically, we found that the 2 groups were a very heterogeneous group with over 50% of the groups failing to meet even a minimum criteria for learning disability diagnosis. Does this make sense, the way I'm describing it? We did replication studies at another university. We were given access to another database. This time we had 158 students who were classified as LD who had received a waiver or course substitution. The findings were exactly the same. No differences at all in the findings. All of these studies were published in the Journal of Learning Disabilities over a period of years. We had then had another group that had gotten waivers and another group that had passed the foreign language courses, had the same testing skills, the same test, and we found exactly the same thing. Now, why does this happen? Why does this happen? It happens because in the United States, that the diagnosis for LD is a free-for-all. One diagnostician uses this, one uses this, one uses this, one uses this, and one doesn't use anything at all, but just says you have a learning disability. And when those evaluations are brought to the school, because of IDEA and the pressure that's put on the schools, a school is loath to tell the parent, no, he doesn't meet the criteria for learning disabilities. So you end up with a lot of students who get classified as LD, who don't meet any criteria for learning disabilities. And so our hypothesis is simply that that's why you see these results. It's not a good situation. In the United States, it's well known that there's really not an empirically valid definition for LD. There are no empirically based criteria for LD, and so as I said, it's a free-for-all. In fact, I can go on about the problems with the learning disability concept if you want me to do that, but Ben Lovett and I have published a series of papers in the past, since 2009, on post-secondary learning disabilities and diagnostic criteria. And three of them are in JLD, three in JLD, 2 in Learning Disability Quarterly, which are just coming out, and 1 in the Journal of Psychoeducational Assessment. And what we're doing is we're looking at the research. What's the database for post-secondary LD diagnoses? And we're finding it's very, 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 very slim. There's just not a lot of evidence out there on this particular concept. And those papers are really interesting because they kind of support what I've been telling you so far about learning disabilities. Everybody knows who's Linda Siegel is?
Yes.
Linda has just asked Ben and I, she asked us a few months ago, she's going to publish a series on the 25th anniversary of her paper in 1989, IQ is irrelevant to the definition of learning disabilities. She's trying to get different people to write on different parts of that. Ben and I were asked to write about post-secondary LD. And the title of our paper is the vampire diagnosis. The vampire diagnosis is a discrepancy diagnosis. It's the diagnostic criteria that just won't die. I'll just give you one example. I do consultant work in the United States for the National Board of Medical Examiners. So let's say that because of Americans with Disability Act, which was passed in 1990, let's say you're a medical student, and you have a diagnosis of dyslexia. Well, in your second year, at the end of your second year of medical school, you have to take the STEP exams. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. So now you want to take Step 1. So you apply to the board, and you want time and a half or double time exam. What happens is there's about 20 of us in the United States who serve as consultants. 6 of us are LD, and I'm one of the LD people. So you send all of your documentation on your learning disability to the board. The board then hires people like us to review it, and it's always sent out to two different reviewers. I've probably done in 6 years, I've probably done about 250 cases. At about 250 cases, 245 of them have used discrepancy as the diagnosis. 245. And here we are in 2011, 12, 13. Discrepancy just won't die. It just won't die. No, we don't use discrepancy for the board. So a lot of medical students, as you would imagine, are very smart. They have IQs of 120 and 130. But if you had the bell curve up here, and I don't think I have another bell curve close by, no. So pretend you have the bell curve up here. Your IQ is up here, right? But you know where your achievement is? It's maybe here. So you might have an IQ of 130, but your reading score is 100 to 110. Do you have a discrepancy? Yes! Therefore, you have a reading disability. No, you don't. You're in the average range. Okay, so with lots of students, I tested one case. The nice thing about that work is I get to use my skills. But a lot of times you go to court because the plaintiff will sue when he or she is denied. And we had one plaintiff, for example, who was very smart. He had had an IEP since 3rd grade. 3rd grade. So 9 years of school, 4 years of undergraduate, got all sorts of accommodations. Medical school for 2 years had accommodations, extra time on test. But yet, when you review the data, every score in reading and spelling and writing was in the average range. Every single score. And we put, for the trial, we put all of his reading scores on a bell curve, just like I'm showing you when I do the bell curves. He had 35 or 40 different measures of reading over those years, and everything was in the average range. So, but there was a smart judge who threw it out. He asked the guy, he said, "Can you read?" He said, "Yeah." Can you read street signs? Yeah. Can you read labels? You can, yeah. Can you read a newspaper? Yeah. Can you read magazines? Yeah. And the judge, of course, is, so, well, what's the problem? Good question.
Is it fair to give a guy who is from a really early age gets all the time and a half, double time, all the help he needs? He has a discrepancy definition or whatever. He has it for all of his life,
yeah.
And he studied everything upon his extra time. Is it fair after 20 years to just take it away from him? It's educationally.
Well, I'll be the devil's advocate. Let's say you're that guy, or girl, right? She's in medical school with you. We test her. She has exactly the same profile as you.
But I get extra time.
You get extra time, and she doesn't, right?
But I was given extra time when I was
Yeah, you
10.
were. Yeah, you were.
So I was educated upon it.
Yeah,
It's
you
not
were.
my fault.
Yeah, you were. That's true. It's not your fault. But what about her? I'm just being devil's advocate. Yeah. What about me? Yes. It's me. I understand. And that is something that's brought up obviously a lot. But in the United States, the courts have ruled up to this point, and whether this will stand, because you know how courts change. Right now, in order to look at whether you meet the criteria for a disability, we have to use what's called the average person standard. So we can't compare you to anyone, or anything else other than your current testing, and we can't compare you to other medical students. We have to compare you to the average person who's your age.
I'm asking because I had a friend in high school who, at a very early age, got excused out of math. And after, I think, maybe 10 years, it was very early on, after 10 years, they discovered that the person who diagnosed him was not licensed, and they withdraw all the diagnoses he made over the years. And we got to the test on like the finishing of high school, and suddenly they tell him he needs to go to test in math, and he hasn't learned math in 10 years.
But,
so that's not fair.
But with medical students, now again, what I'm going to say right now is only apply to medical students because that's the data that I have. If most of the medical students who are denied accommodations and then they take the STEP exams without them, most of them pass.
But is it the person's fault that
The system.
the hypothesis changed
No,
over the time?
No, I agree with you. You won't get any argument from me, but what someone's going to say is, well, what about her? Because she's just like you, right? She's got the same exact profile, same reading skills, same IQ. You're both medical students. And the only difference is over the years that you got help for some reason, and we don't know why. And she did. I have that same problem in my college classrooms. I have students who are getting accommodations who are classified as LD. The likelihood that they are LD is remote. They're getting accommodations. But I've got students in my classes who have worse skills in reading, worse skills in writing, worse skills in spelling, who aren't getting any accommodations. None, because they don't have the diagnosis. So someone would say, is that, it's a problem. I agree with you. But okay, now let's get into the longitudinal studies. The first thing we did some retrospective studies where we look backwards at data that we already have. Our first study, we used what's called a statistical technique called a cluster analysis to examine whether we would find distinct achievement and cognitive and achievement profiles of more and less successful L2 learners. So we looked back at several studies. We had 208 students who had completed 2 years of high school LD courses. We chose them because in the studies, we had administered the same measures of IQ, the same measures of first language. Everything was the same, MLAT, everything. And we wondered what would happen if we used this cluster analysis technique. What we found was that there were 3 distinct cognitive, aptitude, and achievement profiles. Students in the higher achieving cluster, not surprisingly, scored in the above average range on all of these measures. Students in the average achieving cluster in the average range, students in the low achieving cluster in the below average range. Here are the test scores. Does everybody know test scores with a mean of 100, standard deviation of 15? Think of the bell curve, 100 is in the middle. Standard deviation is 15, so the middle of the average range would be 85 to 115 if you're in the middle of the bell curve. So look at the test scores of the high achieving cluster. Really strong, right? Look at the test scores of the low achieving cluster. Really weak, really weak. When you plot it another way, the red line is the high achieving group, the blue line, the low achieving group is in most of our studies, the green line, average achieving group by the note on all of the measures. Look at it another way, there's the low cluster, there's the average cluster, and there's the high cluster. So when you talk about individual differences, there they are. There they are. You look at students who don't do well in foreign languages, and there's the likely reason that they're not doing very well. You look at students who are doing well in foreign languages, at least well as defined by the United States, and they're doing quite well. Does that make sense? Okay. We also did a longitudinal comparison where we compared 4 groups of high school students over 2 years in Spanish, and back to the learning disabled and introduce ADHD here for a second. In the United States, you probably know we have an epidemic of ADHD, right? The last statistic I read is we have something like 98% of the world's kids who have been diagnosed as ADHD. Okay, so it's something over there. I don't know what it is. Be careful when you're over there. You can catch it. It's contagious. That's right. ADHD is like LD. There are literally diagnostic criteria all over the map. A psychiatrist can see you if you're an 8-year-old boy. It can see you for 5 minutes. He'll listen to your parents. He'll look at reports of the teachers. Within 5 minutes, you have a diagnosis of ADHD and a prescription for Ritalin or something. It's a cultural thing. But so we had a group of students who were classified as ADHD. So we went back on these students. They were all high school. We collected their 4th grade and 8th grade reading and language scores from their testing files. We got their 6th grade IQ. We administered the MLAT again. We administered measures of second language proficiency, reading, spelling, etc. And we collected their second language course grades. Now, given our earlier findings, prior to 2000, what were our primary research questions? Again, would there be IQ, first language skills, second language aptitude differences between high achieving and low achieving learners? Between LD, low achieving, and ADHD learners? And if so, how early would those differences emerge? We'd never done anything like this before. How early would those differences emerge? What we found is there were significant differences among the 4 groups, which is what you'd expect. Here's what we found. One of our findings was expected, one was not. That the high achieving and the ADHD groups scored significantly higher than the LD and low achieving groups. That surprised us. Because if you have ADHD, you're also supposed to have some kind of academic issues. These students didn't. They had a diagnosis, but no academic issues, no academic problems. And those differences were apparent as early as 4th grade. Remember, we collected their 4th grade reading and language scores. There were no significant differences between the low achieving and LD groups, which we expected. But what we didn't expect is there were no significant differences between the high achieving and ADHD groups. The ADHD students, high school students, looked exactly in IQ, first language achievement, second language aptitude, looked exactly like the high achieving learners. Which then leads to a question. Why do they have a diagnosis of ADHD?
Well, maybe they're being treated.
Some of them were, many of them weren't. They were treated in the sense that they had accommodations.
Oh, no, I mean, medication.
In some cases, yes, some cases not. Yeah, it's very interesting. We didn't expect that. We expected the ADHD students would be just like the low achieving and the LD students, and they weren't. But we also found, like in previous studies, most LD and low achieving students had passed the second language courses. Now, there's a difference, as you might expect, between passing a second language course and actually learning the foreign language. Okay, everybody knows that, right? Okay, they just pass the courses. Okay, here again, here's the high achieving group. There's the low achieving group scores on all the testing measures. Here's the LD group, no differences. And there's the ADHD group. Pretty similar to the high achieving group, which again, surprised us very, very much. We didn't expect that. So the findings suggested that these first language differences emerged very early, several years before the students even encounter a second language in high school. They emerged, in this case, as early as 4th grade. We also bolstered our hypothesis that as Janina was kind of saying, that second language proficiency runs along a continuum of learners with low to average to high first language skills and second language aptitude. Those were those individual differences emerging in. Now, here's the study that took us 10 years to do. We followed students in one school district close to Cincinnati over 10 years. So we followed the kids from the beginning of first grade. We tested them the first 2 months of their first grade year. We tested them also in second, third, fourth, and fifth grades. We didn't see them for 4 years. And then we tested them again starting in high school when they started foreign language. So we started with 156 students. In the United States, very mobile. Only 101 were still in the district by ninth grade. 71 took second language courses because not everybody takes a foreign language. And 54 finished 2 years of second language courses. Rather high dropout rates of Spanish and French and German. Pretty much equal, males and females. Here's the languages. We had 30 taking Spanish, 14 French, and 10 German. Their first language is English. No prior exposure to the second language that they were studying. No exposure to the second language outside of school. No one had a parent, for example, who spoke the language that they were studying. They all had pretty much the same hours of instruction in school. We administer in grades 1 to 5 measures of first language decoding, spelling, vocabulary, comprehension, phoneme awareness, listening comprehension every year for the first 5 years. We collected their IQ from first grade, their 10th grade reading scores, because everybody has to take a state test. This state had a state test, so we got that. We gave them the second language, the MLAT in ninth grade. We gave them measures, remember the affective things that we talked about? So we gave them measures of L2 motivation, L2 anxiety, which will come back later. And then we had foreign language educators come in at the end of 10th grade after 2 years of the language and measure their ability to read it, to write it, to speak it, to spell it, etc.
How many hours of foreign language do they get a week?
They would get between 4.5 and 5 hours a week. 5 days a week, one period. The periods could be 50 to 60 minutes, depending on the school. Okay. We also gave some first language print exposure measures, if you know those from Keith Stanovich. Those proved to be very interesting also. Okay, so we did a lot of different studies. I'm going to run through them fairly quickly. We did prediction studies, comparison studies, affective studies, factor analysis, and print exposure studies. In the prediction study, what we found, to summarize it, is that early first language literacy in first to fifth grades predicted about 73% of the variance in second language aptitude on the MLAT. And the bulk of that variance was predicted by your word decoding, English word decoding, and English spelling skills. That the findings also showed that your first language reading skills predicted about 40% of the variance in your second language proficiency at the end of 10th grade. And that was we thought that was a fair amount of variance to predict after 10 years of study. So we found some support for that long-term first language and second language connections, and also the importance of your first language literacy for your second language development. In another prediction study in Journal of Ed Psych, we found that your first language decoding, I'll just summarize this, that your first language decoding skills predicted a large amount of the variance in your second language decoding skills. That your first language spelling skills combined with phoneme awareness in your first language predicted a large amount of the variance in your second language spelling skills. It wasn't so much that your first language decoding predicted, it was the fact that it accounted for about 52% of the variance in how well you read Spanish words. Not how well you comprehended, just how well you decoded the words. In another study, we threw kind of everything into the hopper, all the measures that we had given, and said, let's see what predicts your second language proficiency. We found that there were strong correlations between your first language skills in grades 1 to 5 and your second language proficiency in 10th grade. We had correlations up to 0.66, very strong. But still, the MLAT was the best predictor of your second language proficiency in every foreign language proficiency skill, except word decoding. MLAT doesn't predict word decoding. Your first language decoding predicts your second language decoding. Now, here's what we hypothesize. We don't know this for sure. We hypothesize this, that you could have an arrow here that would go from first language skills predicting second language skills. Okay? And there's some truth to that. But if you look at your first language skills in grades 1 to 5, we then administer the MLAT in grade 9, 4 years later. And then we test your foreign language proficiency 2 years later. We hypothesize this. What happens is the second language aptitude test, the MLAT, sucks up or cuts out all of the variance that's predicted by your first language skills. And the reason is this second language aptitude test is just really a measure of how strong your first language skills are. Does that make sense? That's why this test, this second language aptitude test, is really such a really good test. It needs some work. It needs some work. We're doing a study right now where we're using measures of working memory and phonological short-term memory to also use to predict your second language proficiency. And the question is, will working memory add even more variance to the prediction of second language proficiency with the MLA, along with the MLA2? And again, we don't know. We'll find out. We also looked at a study where we did long-term first and second language relationships, and the important takeaway from this particular study is this. We divided the students into high proficiency, second language proficiency, average and low proficiency groups. And then we compared them on all of the first language measures. Here's what we found, is that there were no differences between the three groups in the first language skills in first grade. After first grade, starting in second grade, there were significant differences on every first language measure. Those differences in your first language skills, those individual differences, emerge really early in school. And then what happens is they're related fairly strongly to your second language proficiency all those years later. So there's a strong relationship between first language skills and second language
Do you
skills.
compare between the three languages, Spanish?
No differences.
No
Yeah.
differences?
And we didn't have large groups, remember.
Oh.
We had, what, 30 and 14 and 10.
So it doesn't matter which you think.
Yeah, but on the other hand, all those languages are all, they kind of belong to one group.
Yeah.
Like if we had to do like a study where we had to use those languages and maybe a Semitic language and take
That's true.
Or Chinese.
Yeah,
or-
yeah.
Yeah, but we don't know what we find there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here's an example. You just take a quick look. There's the high proficiency first language, average proficiency first language, low proficiency first language. Same kind of thing that you've been seeing over and over and over and over. Now, here's my favorite study. Actually, my second favorite. We have been out to look at this anxiety study because it's like the vampire diagnosis.
Won't go away.
It won't go away. It won't go away. Every time we go to a second language conferences, we still hear, have you studied anxiety? And we say, haven't you read our papers? No. We've been publishing them since 1994. Take a look at it. Here's what we found in this one. We gave an instrument called the Foreign Language Classroom Anxiety Scale, developed by Elaine Horowitz at University of Texas.
No relation.
No relation, right, no relation. You should go visit her though when you're, she's close by. And here's what we did. We gave that measure, and we divided them into high anxiety, average anxiety, and low anxiety groups based on their answers to that measure. And then we compared them on their first language skills and second language aptitude and second language proficiency. Now, if the anxiety hypothesis is supported, there really shouldn't be anything to this. Well, here's what we found. We found that the high anxiety group exhibited significant first language differences as early as second grade. Now, why is that important? In second grade, these students hadn't even thought about taking a second language. They were worried about reading and getting home on the bus and playing at recess. They weren't worried about Spanish or French or German. They didn't have to for another 7 years. But when we compared their performance on these first language measures, we found that high anxiety group had first language differences as early as second grade. Does that make sense? That's not supposed to happen. It's not supposed to happen, but it did. What it suggests is that those anxiety measures are measuring something different, not anxiety. Not anxiety. Okay? So, our contention has always been that affective differences like anxiety and motivation are language-based. They're related to your achievement in your first language, in this case, into language skills. So here's what we found. Here's the high anxiety group. Here's the average anxiety group's first language skills. And here's the low anxiety groups. Okay? So, y'all have been teachers, you understand that, or you've been, like me, a student in physics. Okay? I had physics anxiety. Okay? If they had given me a physics anxiety survey, I would have been off the charts, because I'm really not very good at physics at all. So I would have been down here somewhere, okay? Because my science acumen is really bad. Okay? So that was what we found in here. Now, we also did a recent study. This has just been published online in Language Learning. We hope that this is the stake that will go through the heart of L2 anxiety and it will stay there this time. I doubt if it will, but we hope. Now, keep in mind, we only had 54 students that we were able to follow for 10 years who finished the second language. But we had full data from grades 1 to 5 on 129 students. So we sent in the paper to Language Learning with the 54 students. And the editor said, well, why don't you do this procedure right here? I never heard of that procedure. So I went to my marvelous statistician, John Patton, and he said, oh yeah, no problem. So what they said is this. This statistical procedure will fill in, if you will, the rest of the data on the students who hadn't taken the MLAT and who hadn't taken a second language. And I don't understand it, don't even pretend to. If I had John here, he could explain it very nicely too. Here's what we found. Now we had 129 cases instead of 54, which is a lot better. Here's what we found, is that the foreign language classroom anxiety scale, the L2 anxiety measure, accounted for significant unique variance in your first language skills way, way, way back in primary school, before students had even encountered a second language. It also explains significant variance in your second language aptitude, the MLAT. Now again, is that supposed to happen? No. Anxiety is supposed to be independent of your language ability, okay? It's not. It's not. The two are intimately related. The likelihood that second language anxiety causes second language difficulty, high proficiency or low proficiency, is remote, very remote. Okay, this is the factor analysis. I won't go through this too much. Basically, it just shows that, remember I've suggested to you that second language aptitude is componential. There's phonology, there's grammar, etc. This is what this study showed. We did a factor analysis on the database of the students over the 10-year study and found exactly. We also did print exposure. Is everybody familiar with Stanovich's print exposure measures from his studies? Stanovich is a genius, just a genius. He developed these measures that will measure how much print exposure you had. And he found in his studies over the years that your print exposure, how you do on these little 5, 6, 8, 10-minute measures, will predict the strength of your first language vocabulary, your first language spelling, all sorts of things, just marvelous studies. And we thought, let's administer these and see if they account for any variance in how well you learn a second language. Why? Because we found these intimate connections between your first and your second language, right? So maybe print exposure would add some variance. So we gave the print exposure measures, and what we found was just absolutely fascinating, is that even after, when you do regression analyses, even after you control for the effects of the variance in second language proficiency that was explained by your first language skills, by the MLAT, by your IQ, and your 10th grade reading skills. So we explained the variance and all there, and then print exposure in your first language still contributes about 4 to 5% of variance in your second language comprehension, 3% to your word decoding, 6% to your listening and speaking, and about 4 to 6% to your overall proficiency. Now, basically what's it suggesting? That if you read when you're a little kid, up until the time you take a foreign language in high school, what is reading supposed to do for you? It gives you a better vocab, right? It gives you better spelling. It gives you better grammar. It gives you better language comprehension because your vocabulary is good. It gives you more general knowledge. It just makes you better in language, right? And if it makes you better in your first language, our findings are showing that the better your first language is, the better your second language is. So what's important here is that those kids who had larger amounts of print exposure, in other words, who read more, got off to a good start in reading in first grade and second grade, those kids did better in second languages. And print exposure itself has some predictive value for how well you're going to do in second language. And that, for us, those findings were just fascinating because we thought we might have something, but we weren't sure. We also did another study. This was just published in Reading and Writing about a year ago. We took the students and divided them into 3 groups: high print exposure, average print exposure, low print exposure, based on their scores on those measures. We wondered whether the students would exhibit differences in their first language skills, their second language aptitude, and if so, how early would they exhibit. What we found was that group differences among the different levels of print exposure emerged as early as first grade. So if you were high in print exposure, you had significantly higher reading, spelling, second language aptitude, etc., than students with average and low print exposure. Here again, suggesting that print exposure is important.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, so let's move on. Oh, this is just the student scores, first language scores on their print exposure measures. Okay, I'm going to skip the simple view. I'm going to go to what we're doing now since we just had 5 minutes. Okay, here's the one thing I'm going to explain about the simple view. Everybody knows the simple view of reading? Yes. Okay. Nobody had ever done this in America, looking at whether the simple view of reading would explain second language reading. So with American students. So here's what I did. There's a test called the Woodcock-Johnson. There's also a Spanish version of the Woodcock-Johnson called the Woodcock-Munoz. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to compare English language learners, English students whose native language is English, to norms from Spanish speakers and how well they did in reading. Now, you say, well, that isn't fair. Right? It's not fair. But wait a minute, in the United States, and I'm sure you do it here too, maybe I'm wrong, we have no compunction whatsoever about comparing ELL learners' performance on measures of English reading and English spelling, and we compare them to American students. So why can't we just turn it around? So that's what I did. These are standard scores. These are standard scores. You have a student who's taken 2 years of foreign language, and now you compare him to native Spanish readers. Native Spanish readers in decoding, in comprehension, pseudo-word decoding, and vocabulary. Now, these aren't raw scores. These are standard scores. Mean of 100, standard deviation of 15. The average American student in this study was over 2 standard deviations below the mean if he's compared to 9th graders. Look at this score. You know what that means? You're almost 6 standard deviations below the mean in comprehending Spanish. This is after 2 years of learning Spanish in the United States. 6 standard deviations below the mean. Why? Look at your vocabulary. You're 6 standard deviations below the mean in Spanish vocabulary. The American students didn't reach an average range in decoding until they were compared to 4th grade Spanish readers. Even when compared to 1st grade Spanish readers, they're still 5 standard deviations below the mean. Does that make sense? They're not very good. And that's being charitable. That's being charitable. They're not very good. And other things that we did with this data, you find the same thing.
It just shows how very difficult it is to learn a foreign language.
Especially if you're in an American context. Especially.
Well, it would be interesting to compare
Take a look at
our
this.
students learning English.
Go down, hang on, let me go down to, there's 4th grade. There's where American students finally reach an average range in decoding. Look on the bell curve where their vocabulary and reading comprehension is. 1st grade, now they're doing pretty well in decoding, aren't they? Compared to 6-year-old Spanish kids. Those X's barely budged. Barely budged. So they can decode it, but they can't comprehend it, largely because of vocabulary, not exclusively, but largely. This is a paper I'll present at SSSR, and the question is, think of this simple view, 4 kinds of readers, right? Good, dyslexic, hyperlexic, garden variety. The name of the paper is, are US L2 readers hyperlexic? Answer is, yeah, they are. Yeah, they are. Out of 165 students, 161 fit the hyperlexic profile. Finally, last thing. Just starting a new study, it's been going on almost a year. What we're doing now is we're going to follow students over 2 to 3 years of Spanish high school students. 4 high schools in a large district. We'll have about 300 by the time we finish. 2 2 years of Spanish. Chose them at random from Spanish 1 classes in each school, 50% males, females. This study has a lot of purposes, one of which is to renorm the MLAT. The MLAT is a great test. The norms are over 50 years old. It's got to be renormed. Got to be renormed. So there's a lot of things. So what we did is we administered the MLAT to 830 students back in August. From that, we chose 325 at random to continue because we just don't have the people power to test 850 students one-to-one over these years. We administered all of the first language measures, English, phonological memory, working memory, everything in the fall. And those are the first language measures. Now we're in the process of administering the measures of Spanish, word decoding, fluency, vocabulary, all these different things. Then at the end of next year, April, May 2015, we'll do the same thing, see how much they progressed. And for those students who take Spanish 3, which I said maybe about 20% of them, will do the same thing. And the idea is to see how well these measures predict foreign language proficiency over the years, but especially with these new measures of working memory and phonological memory. The last thing I'll mention is this, is that in this study, I work with 2 foreign language professors who are going to administer. Does everybody know what an OPI, oral proficiency interview? What happens is this, is if I'm, well, you be the Hebrew professor, okay? I've learned Hebrew for 2 years, okay, in the classroom, in the United States, not in Israel, okay? So I just learned Hebrew in the classroom. So I come in and I sit down. Janina explains to me, you're going to do an interview.
The right Hebrew professor.
Right. And I say, go ahead, just ask me something in Hebrew.
מה שלומך?
No tengo gato. Pretty good. I don't have a cat. Spanish. Yes. This is what will happen. In our first study, one of our first studies, we scheduled the oral proficiency interviews for 15 to 20 minutes. We were naive. They would come walking out of the room with the interviewer after 2 to 3 minutes. And the interviewer, Dr. Humbach, would come out. And she said, I asked him what his name was in Spanish. And he said, huh? I asked him if they knew what his name was in Spanish. I asked him how old he is. And he said, huh? Or he'd say 19 or 14 or whatever. And she'd say that in Spanish. And of course you get something like 14-0. We're getting that now in the studies, what we're doing. I'll show them an I. Picture of an I, and you're supposed to say it in Spanish. I-O. A cat. Cat-O. Now this is after a whole year of Spanish, right? So this is the context of the United States. So we got smarter in this study. We've set the oral proficiency interviews for 10 minutes. Even that's probably going to be too long. But at least we'll get some measures. So in conclusion, let me just go through a few conclusions of what we found over the years. Students' first language skills are strongly related to their second language proficiency. Study after study after study after study shows that. That first and second language learning may depend on basic language components that are similar in both languages. There are long-term first and second language relationships. We found as many as 9 to 10 years earlier. There's a strong relationship. These differences in first language skills emerge very early in primary school, as early as first and second grade. And they affect your later second language and proficiency achievement down the road. Problems with one language component may affect your development both in the first and the second language. Affective differences, motivation, anxiety, are much more likely to be related to your level of first language skill and your second language aptitude, not to any anxiety. The L2 aptitude is measured by the MLAT as a very good predictor of L2 proficiency and achievement. Again, somebody wants to do a doctoral program and translate that? Please, please. I'd be very happy to come back to Israel and help you with that. And stay for a lot longer time. L1 print exposure and success in early first language reading is likely related to second language proficiency and achievement. Again, many, many years later. Many years later. LD students have first and second language profiles similar to low achieving non-LD students, although, caveat, that may be related to the United States. I don't know how you diagnose LD here, whether you have the same problems that we do with that diagnosis in the United States. The simple view of reading model explains second language skills in US L2 learners. The findings seem to be very similar to other studies. For various reasons, as we talked about with the US context, US students exhibit very low achievement in second language learning, and most US L2 readers display hyperlexic reading profiles, which is going to be something interesting when I present it not at SSSR. SSSR folks will go, yeah, that makes sense. But if I go to a foreign language conference and present this, there will be significant disagreements, that's probably what to say. Because think of it, if you're a foreign language teacher in the United States, that's your context, okay? So if you're my best student, I'm thinking, you're great, right, in Spanish. But if we test you, we find out that your comprehension is 6 standard deviations below the mean. So everybody else is a 7 and 7, 7. So that's a tour de force, tour de farce, I'm not sure what it is, or what we've done over about 25 years. So any questions you want to ask? I hope I haven't stepped on the toes of all of you learning disability. But it is a real problem in the United States, a very real problem, as is the ADHD issue. So.
Thank you very, very much for the wonderful presentation. I have 2 questions. Will you give us a taste of the MLIT items, or how it's really assessed?
How is it mentioned?
Yeah, how it's really.
The test, in the old days, we had the cassette tapes. Now they have a CD, thank goodness. You can administer it one-to-one, or you can put it, what I did is I put it on a computer, and then we tested large groups of 20, 30 students at a time. It takes about an hour to an hour and 5 minutes. And you have a test, you have an answer sheet, you have a practice exercise sheet, and a test book. So you have 3 things. All you need is a pencil and headphones. This is the elementary part right here. This is the elementary MLIT. And there's almost no research that's been done with the elementary part. So the test is on a CD.
Which is completely suitable to an Israel setting, because that's when children start learning fast.
They have a test booklet.
Yeah.
They have a test booklet. They have, where's the answer sheet? In there somewhere?
In fact, Elite Olstein claims that in the 1960s it was translated into Hebrew. But when I tried to follow that up, nobody had any idea where it was and what happened to it.
And so the students have those materials, and you simply start the CD. It runs continuously. Part of the test is speed and fluency. So you get a certain amount of time on each subtest, a certain amount of time on each item. You can't stop taping.
It's all in English.
Well, it's in a fake foreign
Fake.
language. Some of it is English. For example, in the first subtest, it's called number bar. So what they do is they very quickly teach you the numbers in a fake foreign language for 1, 2, 3, 4, 20, 30, 40, 100, 200, 300. Then they say, okay, now it's your turn. You have your answer sheet, and the person is going to say, Tish na mu da da. And you have to write 241. Nadabu, 15 or 14. And they just keep coming at you every few seconds. Okay? And the second subtest is called phonetic script. So the language that John Carroll called was Kurdish. So there might be a word T-A-Z. Well, in English it's Taz, but he says Taz. T-I-Z in English, tis, tease. And so you've got 4 words, and you have to learn the pronunciation of each word. Of course, for English learners, the A is going to be confusing because it's not ah, it's ah. The I is going to be confusing because it's not it, it's ed. And then he keeps adding more and more sounds. The third is he gives you a word. Emblem, M-B-L-M. That's all he gives you. You have to look at it and go, oh, emblem. And then 5 answers, multiple choice, 5 words. You have to choose the word closest in meaning to emblem. So in order to get to the vocabulary part, you have to get through the phonetic coding part. That's called spelling clues. And they start off easy, emblem's easy. You have words like whimsical, really hard words.
What you're going to the challenge is to translate it into Arabic or Hebrew, and it has to take on that same sort of flavor.
Yes. The 4th subtest is the bane of every student's existence in the United States. It's grammar. Nobody knows grammar in the United States. Nobody. And so here's what they do. They give you a sentence, and there's a word underlined, maybe in. Then they give you a sentence, and they underline 5 words. And it's an A, B, C, D, E format. You have to choose the word in the second sentence that has the same grammatical function or part of speech as in. So if you go to the next one and it has another preposition, that's the one that you can pick. 45 items and you get 15 minutes. That subtest, when you divide the subtest and you compare the students, even for the best foreign language learners, that's the lowest score every single time. It never fails. The fifth subtest, when John Carroll developed this test in the 50s, the state of the art for memory was paired associate learning. So what you have is a word encouraged, H-I-J, and it's connected to an English word, boy, or dog, or something else. You get 4 minutes. There are 24 words, you get 4 minutes to memorize them. And then you turn your test over, and then you start the test, and you have a multiple choice format. So for H-I-J, you put 4 words, one of which is the target word. And it's just a rote memorization. That subtest is the one that we're looking at here. It's probably the weakest of the 5 because now paired associate learning is not standard working memory phonological. So what we're hoping is this, is we're going to add the working memory and the phonological short-term memory as predictors and see if it adds any more variance in the MLAT. What we'd like to do eventually is we would love to see you take out paired associate learning and you put in working memory to the MLAT. Would that enhance the predictive value? So we'll also do that in addition to renorming the MLAT. Again, in Israel, I don't know if you have this problem, but this test was normed in '58. Well, in 1958 in the United States, only about 40% of high school students took foreign languages. It was top end of the bell curve. Now about 65 to 70% do. The norms can't be the same as they were in 1958. So we've already done one pilot study and found that learners in 2006, I think it was, 6 or 7, significant differences on every subtest, all 5 subtests from the 1958 norms. So now we're going to add this database. We had about 650. Here we have about 830. So we're going to have almost 1,500. And likely, we'll find that there are significant differences. Does that explain the MLAT?
Thank you very much.
So it'd be an easy test to translate into Hebrew.
Or keep it like this for English.
I'm sorry.
Or we might can keep it like this for English because we do have English as a second language.
Yeah, but
Right.
for English as a second language,
Yeah.
what I've seen, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because you need to have some kind of first language ability in order to be able to function on the English test.
And see, what I don't know is because
It's
this,
whimsical, it's just not even,
whimsical, yes.
yeah.
Because
Even
this test has norms. The MLAT, the current version or the version we're using, has norms for 9th graders, 10th graders, 11th graders in the United States, for adults, college students, and for Air Force enlisted personnel, because it's used a lot for the military. Whether that test would work with learners in other countries, I don't know, because you start languages so early. But you could do it in reverse. You could say, do better English learners in Israel have higher second language aptitude. But then with this elementary MLAT, you can give this to students as young as 3rd grade, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. So what I'd love to see is somebody to translate this test, give it to 3rd graders who are just now starting to learn, let's say their first language is Hebrew. Give it to 3rd graders who are just now starting to learn English, and then follow them over time, over 1, 2, 3, or more years, and find out whether this particular test, the elementary version, is a good predictor of English language learning. And that would be, I think that would be a fascinating study to do.
I think there's other factors in Israel for learning English, cultural factors. We gotta have it, and it's more difficult than your second learning because the alphabet is different. You also need to decode a new alphabet, but it's easier because we're much more exposed, and we gotta have it just to function,
Exactly.
just to watch movies.
Exactly. So there could be, in addition to any empirical quantitative findings you might have with this, there are going to be other factors that enter in, which might change what we have found, in the United States. Findings could be different. Who knows? That's why you do research to find out. That's why it's fun. You never know. You think you know. You know, we knew that there was a foreign language learning disability. We knew it. But guess what? There's not. I published a paper in 2006, which looked at all the empirical evidence, showing that there's no evidence that there's a disability for learning a foreign language. There's no evidence that you can even have any way to diagnose it. Some people would say, well, let's just look at, you know, there's this discrepancy, there's IQ and achievement, right? So here's what we'll do. Instead of IQ, we'll give the MLAT. That's your aptitude, right? And then we'll look at your discrepancy between your aptitude and your first language performance. Well, that doesn't work very well. We'll do something else. All sorts of hypotheses have been proposed, but there's simply no evidence that there is. And the other thing is, does everybody know what DSM is? Here's the other problem. You can really only have a disability, according to the DSM, in a daily life activity or a major life function, right? In the United States, second language is not a daily life activity or a major life function. So forget even what the evidence says. In the United States, you can't have a disability for it because it's not a major life function. You don't do it. So you've got both that particular idea and the fact that the evidence suggests that there's just no such thing. But in the United States, if you go on websites for some colleges, here's what they'll say. When you go to the disability policies, they'll say, if you have a foreign language learning disability, you can get substitutes and waivers. They don't pay any attention to what the evidence says in terms of second language learning. They just pay no attention to it. So, did that answer your question? Did you have another one?
Yeah.
Anybody else have any questions? Please.
Do you think that the depth of the orthography would make any difference between the first and second language?
Probably. In the United States, we just have the Spanish, the French, and the German. And here, we didn't find any differences in the performance in second language between the three. But we had very small groups, 30, 14, and 10 in that 10-year study. So, you know, I don't know, but it would have to make some difference in learning to read it and spell it. So the answer is probably yes. From our talks last night, think of how different English spelling is than Hebrew spelling. And I've been told that it's very hard.
Well, also the distance between your first language, and we've done some studies and it's shown the difference and the distance between the languages make a big difference as well. It's worth continuing investigating.
English, what I teach my students in my classes is I teach a course called phonics and linguistics. And because of, am I allowed to say whole language? Knocking at the table. Because of whole language, most of my students in college come to college with very little knowledge of their first language. They can read it, but they don't know why they can read it or how. They can spell it, but they don't know how. It's just not good. And so you have to start off with just teaching them short vowels. I'll say how many sounds in cat. So they'll go cat 1. And say, well, no, it sounds like one sound. You have to teach about phoneme words. Then you ask them something like this. The A in cat sounds like A. Yeah. Why doesn't it sound like A? Because you know A can have A and A, right? And they'll think a minute, and the first answer usually is just cuz. The second answer, once I tell them that's wrong, they'll say, oh, it doesn't have an E on the end to make the A long. So I'll go to the board and I'll write have and done. Well, this has an E, but the vowels aren't long, so let's go back to cat. Of course, nobody's ever taught them about closed syllables. And they look at it, and I'll say, I'm going to write about 10 nonsense words on the board. So I'll write 10 closed syllables. I'll say, you ever seen these words? And they'll say, no. Read them. They read them just fine. And I look, How did you read those? You've never seen those words before. How did you read them? And you read them quickly. And they'll look at you, even though they've been told about closed syllables, and they'll look at you like, what do you mean? What do you mean? And so you have to point out that VAP, you read it as VAP. You didn't even think about vape, did you? No. Why? Because you have one vowel followed by at least one consonant, and generally the vowel is short. And you can see this look in this. Oh, okay. Nobody's ever taught them that before. Nobody. Nobody's ever taught them that the reason the E is on have is because we don't end words in B. And you use the E as a marker. It has to be there to make the word look right. That's it. Or the one we were talking about last night. Want me to ask them? Why in the word course, C-O-U-R-S-E? If anybody knows this, don't say anything. The rest of it. Why is there an E on the end of the word course? The E doesn't do anything to the vowels, right? So why is it there? Just cause.
No, maybe it's an origin one, like it comes from French or something.
That's the first thing you think of, okay? In this case, the E is a marker. If you take off the E, you have C-O-U-R-S. In English, when you end a word, a lot of words in S, it makes it plural. The E has to be there to keep the word course from being plural. C-O-U-R is not a word, is it? You have more than one core. That's why the E is there. And you tell students that, and they're impressed. Okay? But they start getting the idea that this is really hard. This is really hard. And then, of course, you introduce the schwa sound. And all hell breaks loose. Because they don't get the schwa sound. And they'll just say, well, why don't we do this? Well, because we don't. It's just English.
And they're all language one English.
Yes. 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 They think that spelling is just memorization. And it's not. It's not. So even
Unfortunately, EFL teachers also very often think that.
yeah, and it's not. It's something where you have to know the structure of the language. And so the students come in and they have to learn the phonology, they have to learn phonics, they have to learn the orthography, they have to learn the morphology. None of them. You ask an American college student to define root, prefix, and suffix. Blank look. They may know prefix or suffix, root, they've never heard of it. They've never heard of it. And of course they haven't had Latin, and 60% or so of English words are Latin-based. They haven't had Latin anymore. And so when you start talking Latin, here again, so they have a lot to learn just about their own language. It's hard for them. It's really hard for them. So I can only imagine how hard it must be for them. Yeah. Any other questions?
You have to go on to other things.
Yeah, feel free if you want to stick around and ask questions. Please feel free to do so. And if you do want a copy of the presentation, just feel free to send me an email. Just go to Mount St. Joe's website and my email's on there. I'll be happy to send it to you. So, thank you.